Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Another video for you. Doing these updates as often as I can, pretty much daily since this war began. And of course, it will continue as long as the need is there. I'm going to try to run through kind of a long list of things that I wanted to cover as quickly as I can. But if I run out of time, then I would just say that I'll probably end up covering everything else in an exclusive on the Patreon page. You can go to patreon.com/ Eric Draitzer and become a supporter there, and you'll have access to everything, whether or not it makes it into one of these free videos or not. So, all right, let's just talk about what's happening here. I'm recording here on March 1st. It is 8 o'clock p.m. on the East Coast in the United States. I'll just begin by talking a little bit about the military situation. As I've said every single time I bring up military issues, I'm not a military analyst, so I am reporting based on what I have sort of gathered from many different sources as best I can. But I think the primary issue here is that there has been, to some extent, a false narrative painted by the Western corporate press, maybe wishful thinking, delusion, propaganda, combination of those things, but essentially peddling the narrative that the Russians are falling flat on their face, that they're being stymied, that they're bungling this operation, they haven't made the progress that they would have expected, and that generally Russia is bad and sucky and poo poo, right? So that is what we get in the Western press in the US in particular and in European media. The reality seems to be actually quite the opposite as we finish up here day 6 of this war, and it looks like the Russian military has actually made pretty significant progress. And again, I don't say this to say anything good or bad about Russia and their military and whether they have, tremendous capabilities or that they've been overstated. It simply seems to be the facts. And here are the facts as I understand them. Kiev is under assault from various directions, but in a relatively, I guess you could say somewhat restrained way. It looks like the real fighting has happened in Kherson, where I believe it's now confirmed, at least from local residents, that Kherson has fallen to the Russians. Similarly, Mariupol, also this port city in the Donetsk region, that too is now. If it hasn't fallen, it is surrounded. Ukrainian forces seem to be surrounded with no way out there. We're hearing reports on social media of some of these Ukrainian soldiers basically saying that, if I don't ever make it out alive, tell people what happened here. More or less, this is the Alamo kind of situation. And I think this also seems to be true in Kharkov and a number of other major cities. So, what is this telling us? This is telling us that slowly but surely the Russian military seems to be tightening the noose around the edges of Ukraine and generally moving towards the center of the country and towards the capital. Now, there are, of course, a lot of things in the way and a lot of variables. Sabotage, which we've seen a number of times already, including today from the Ukrainian forces blowing up bridges in advance of Russian military needing them and so forth. But all of this, I would imagine, would have been accounted for by Russian military planners. And I don't believe that this is going to be a significant obstacle for them. Um, as I said, major cities have been encircled, and let's just be reasonable and honest in this assessment here. The Russian military is doing this with a relatively small percentage of its overall firepower and overall forces. I've read a couple of analyses from military experts who have more or less put the number at somewhere between 10 and 30% of Russian military capability has been employed thus far. We haven't seen the use of fixed wing aircraft. We haven't seen major bombing, anything like this. So I think it bears repeating that we should not fall into this false sense of triumphalism or whatever it is that the corporate press in the West is trying to gin up here. I really think that we should be honest and sort of reasonable in understanding what's happening. And what's happening is the Russians are conquering Ukraine slowly but surely. At least that's how it seems. Anything can happen, things can certainly change, but that is what seems to be the reality right now. I want to talk now about the issue of fake news and propaganda. This is, of course, part and parcel of this information war. We've seen a number of stories that have been debunked within hours or a day or two of them having been reported. And some of this is really, I think, important for us to sort of pierce through the narrative. Again, I keep saying narrative, but the discourse, the talking points, whatever you want to call it, the way that the mainstream press in the United States and in Europe is trying to get us to think about the conflict on a day-to-day basis. And we need to be very careful not to fall into that trap. The truth is that everything that's happening is in flux and everything should be questioned. So we had reports yesterday of the Chechen detachment, the Kadyrov's elite guards that were sent into Ukraine, that they had all been destroyed, that their leader had been killed, and the leader having been infamous for leading the purges of LGBTQ folks in Chechnya, some of the really awful sort of pogroms that were carried out against the LGBT community there. The leaders who were responsible for that, well, supposedly had just been killed in Ukraine. Here we are 12 hours later, 24 hours later, video comes out of these fighters are still out there, they're still doing their thing, right? Similarly, this report that had come across various Telegram channels, within the sort of pro-Ukrainian, media ecosystem or what have you, that that saboteurs had blown up bridges and that a Russian convoy had been absolutely devastated, up to supposedly 800 vehicles having been destroyed. Just ask yourself really honestly, do you believe that 800 vehicles could be destroyed and you wouldn't have definitive evidence of this? I mean, let's be critical thinkers here and try to imagine what 800 vehicles would look like. It would be a massive convoy that would be covered, that you could see on satellites and photos and live videos and everything. There's no way, there's no evidence of a lot of stories that are coming out. And this is again where we need to remember that we are in the middle of the information war, and the information and propaganda is coming from both sides, and it's coming very, very, very fast. All right. I want to talk now about a statement that was made by Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov. This is in regard to Russia's sort of historical argument for what they're doing in Ukraine. Remember, the Russian mission, the stated mission, is to denazify Ukraine. And as I've discussed in several other videos, this is partially true and partially not. That is to say, Ukraine as a Nazi state. Again, the neo-Nazi influences, just to sort of recap what I've said many times before already, the neo-Nazi influences there. Some of the far right networks are very, very real and significant in various ways, but they do not control the Ukrainian state, nor do they win in elections, nor are they terribly popular according to any opinion polls. They do not jive with most of Ukraine's mainstream society and culture, though they do have some level of political influence. Now, Lavrov brings up the point, and I have his quote here. I tweeted it out, and I'm gonna make sure that I have the quote. Okay, Lavrov says, in talking about Ukraine and what it is that Russia's really objecting to here, he says, quote, the lie about World War II is being shamelessly propagated. Hitler's local henchmen declared heroes, and real anti fascist heroes are forgotten. Monuments to the victors of fascism are demolished. War criminals who fought in the ranks of the Third Reich are glorified. End quote. Lavrov is talking, of course, about the dueling historical perspectives on what happened in Ukraine during the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as it's called in Russia and in Ukraine. And essentially, the idea here being that the current Ukrainian state is, if not a Nazi state, then glorifies a Nazi tradition and a Nazi past with the glorification of Bandera and the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and all of the other Nazi collaborators who sided with Germany against the Soviet Union in World War II. And in fact, they didn't just side with them. It wasn't like they just simply took a position. They were the leading edge of some of the worst atrocities that were committed, including, if you notice now today on social media, the talk of the Russians having bombed Babi Yar, the Babi Yar Memorial, where the mass killings of Jews took place, etc. Right? This this doesn't happen without the Ukrainian nationalists, the Banderists, and so forth, right? So this history that the Russians point to bolster their argument that Ukraine is a Nazi state, it's so very real. And Lavrov is absolutely, correctly pointing out that the Nazi collaborator side of Ukraine's history is being glorified for the purposes of developing a Ukrainian nationalism that is far right in its nature and anti-Russian, and that those Nazi collaborators are glorified, despite having, obviously been on the side of Hitler, despite having carried out all of the atrocities that they carried out, etc. Right, and that they are glorified. Slava Ukraina, right? The glory to Bandera, right? And that Lavrov is saying the real anti-fascist heroes, like my grandfather, for example, who fought to liberate Sevastopol, who fought to liberate Kiev, who fought in the liberation of Prague. My grandfather was a real anti fascist hero. He did fight and destroy and kill Nazis and do all of those things. He didn't side with Nazis, he fought against them. So there's a historical memory that provides a context to understanding the Russian argument here. And Lavrov is probably the most articulate of all of the Russian regime voices, and he makes the point correctly that erasing the real anti-fascist history and replacing it with this sort of whitewashed Nazi collaborationist history and making the Nazi collaborators into heroes is a gross misrepresentation of history and an affront to a lot of people who laid down their lives to defeat the Nazis. So, and my grandfather's been gone almost 30 years now, but if I could put myself into his position, being from Ukraine, from Odessa, as so many Soviet Jews were, right? And understanding what the mass killings were about and what the Holocaust was, and understanding who sided where. Do you think that those who sacrificed everything in that war could possibly tolerate this sort of affront? I don't think so. Right. And historical memory is weaponized. I don't want to say it's visceral in Russia. We don't have in the United States anything remotely comparable to the collective trauma of the Second World War in Russia. And so to say that a country on your border is trying to erase that history and replace it with a falsified history that glorifies collaborators, this is intolerable. Now, is this really what the war is about? Of course not. Russia's interests are imperial in nature. Russia is reasserting Russian imperialism generally, and that this is a criminal war that they have waged. But let's not pretend that everything that the Russians are saying about this history is false, because it isn't. All right, let me quickly move to the issue of Belarus. Belarus forces allegedly crossing over the border into Ukraine. I'm going to hold off on making a firm proclamation on this, only because I don't know if this is officially confirmed. I've seen it stated several times, but if that's the case, again, this gets back to what I've been discussing for a while now: the internationalization of this conflict, with the potential for it to spiral out of control. We need to we need to be very careful in how we think about wars and the way that they evolve. Wars don't just stay contained within the borders of a given state. Oftentimes they spill over into neighboring countries. They spill over into every arena of life. And I think that in this case, with Belarus and the political instability in that country, that we may be seeing something akin to what we're seeing in Russia, namely an opposition movement that is more or less forcibly suppressed, while a autocratic dictatorial regime more or less throws its lot in with Russia. I mean, this is a very serious escalation, and of course, it also means that the Ukrainian military can start firing rockets and missiles directly into Belarus. If now Belarus is officially and formally a belligerent in this war. All right, so I want to move on and talk about another story. This was in Al Monitor today, and it really jives with what I was saying. I think it was in the video last night, or maybe it was 2 days ago, and that is with regard to another aspect of the internationalization of the Ukraine conflict. And this is very predictable. I've been talking about it for a while, and namely that the conflict in Syria now spills over into Ukraine. Of course, you have a lot of the Russian special forces, Wagner mercenaries, military forces, and others that took part in the years of operations in Syria. They're now operating in Ukraine. And guess who else is going to have a vested interest in getting into Ukraine? The same people who were fighting the Russian military and the Syrian military, that Assad was controlling, and the various militias and so forth. Those elements, whether they are from the criminal gangs and networks associated with ISIS and the various other terror groups, whether they are organized crime outfits or what have you, these elements, these forces, some of which have connections to various intelligence agencies, as we know from WikiLeaks and other documents, these forces are now going to look at Ukraine as a potential theater for this conflict. Never mind the fact that anti Russian neo Nazi elements from around Europe would see the same thing in Ukraine. Never mind the fact that the anti Kadyrov Chechen forces, some of whom had historically been linked to Al Qaeda, will also see a potential opportunity in Ukraine. So, if we're not careful, and if there isn't a ceasefire and the beginnings of a political resolution here soon, we could be watching an absolute disaster unfolding as this war devolves into, I don't even know what it would be at that point. An extremely complicated mix of factional rivalries and vendettas and score settling and CIA tricks and everything in between. So keep an eye on the relationship between the conflict in Ukraine and those criminal networks that we so often call terrorist organizations from Syria and elsewhere. I'm already pushing up against 20 minutes, so I'm gonna have to just quickly pick and choose. I'm gonna just pick one more story to talk about here today, and that is the latest statements from Erdogan and Turkey regarding its position within this whole conflict, as I've been talking about for a while. And if you're a subscriber on the Patreon, you know, because I've been talking about it for months and months. But Turkey is one of the true emerging imperial powers. Turkey, with its neo-Ottoman foreign policy, sees itself as not only of equal standing to the other regional imperial powers, but that Turkey can operate in ways that the others can't. And here we have an example of this. Remember that Turkey has close ties with Russia in a lot of ways, sometimes with regard to pipelines and with regard to nuclear technology and exports and things like that. But also, Turkey is a NATO member. So Turkey has this very interesting balance that it strikes. And that is why Turkey is an interesting player here, because as of today, and there was a question about how Turkey would respond, but as of today, the question of Turkey and the closure of the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, namely the closure of access to the Black Sea, that seems to have been settled, though maybe not definitively. And so, just as background, the treaty of the Montreux Treaty, which is one of the foundational treaties that established modern Turkey, holds that Turkey has the right, the inalienable right, to close those straits, the Bosporus Dardanelles Straits, in time of war. Now, we are now in a time of war. But Russia is a very powerful naval power that sees the Black Sea as within its sphere of influence. Does Turkey want to get into a direct confrontation with Russia over the closure of the strait? Well, the interesting thing about this is it seems that Turkey is, as usual, trying to play both sides because, on the one hand, they said yes, they are adhering to the Montreux Treaty and they're applauded by the Biden administration for doing so. On the other hand, they seemed a little bit soft in terms of the language they were using. And it's very clear that they're at least indirectly coordinating with the Russians because the Russians haven't even requested access through there yet. So, what this ultimately means is that the Russians have been gauging the Turkish response here. They gave it several days, waited to see how Turkey was going to respond, and now Turkey finally comes out and makes, more or less a middle of the road kind of statement. This is really an important issue to keep an eye on, especially keeping in mind that Turkey itself is angling to be a Black Sea power, exploring in the Black Sea for gas, ramping up their activities in the Eastern Mediterranean, etc. So Turkey plays a very important role here, and there is a military and strategic ramifications for Russia depending on the decisions that Turkey takes. Okay, we'll have to leave it there. I'm already at 20 minutes. A lot more to discuss. I go over to the Patreon page. I got a couple of more videos that should be up in the next day or so. I want to talk a little bit more about Russia's allies around the world, what these alliances tell us, and what we can know about the imperial chessboard moving forward. But for now, thank you so much for listening. Talk to you again real soon.